Which is a better opening move for white? 1 G4 or 1 E4? Incorrect. This doesn't attack the center of the board, and it weakens white's king side. Moreover, the G-pawn is now a potential target. If it's threatened, it will have to be defended, or moved to an even more vulnerable spot. Correct. This is one of the best ways to begin a chess game. The king-pawn occupies a center square, E4, and attacks another, D5. By moving the E-pawn, white also clears the lines to develop two pieces, the queen and the king-bishop at F1. If you start the game this way, you're playing a king-pawn game. Which is a better first move for white? 1 D4 or 1 A4? Correct. White's D-pawn occupies a central square, D4, and lays claim to another, E5. The move D2-D4 also enables the queen-bishop at C1 to come into the game, while providing some breathing room for the queen on the D-file. If you begin this way, you're playing a queen-pawn game. Incorrect. This move ignores the center and doesn't add much to white's developing capabilities. For in the opening, the queen-rook at A1 seldom gets the opportunity to enter the game along the A-file. Many newcomers wrongly think that this is the natural way to develop a rook at the game start, by pushing the rook pawn in front of it and then moving the rook straight up the board behind the advancing pawn. Actually, in most cases, the rook is mobilized along the home rank to a destination square on the most open, active, and/or useful file. Only occasionally is it activated by moving up and exchanging away the rook pawn that impedes it. Which is a better first move for white? 1 C3 or 1 C4? Incorrect. This move does attack a central point, D4, but it unnecessarily blocks C3, taking away the ideal developing square for the queen-knight at B1. And though it opens the A4-D1 diagonal for white's queen, as does the move C2-C4, the advance C2-C3 doesn't make it possible for any of the minor pieces, bishops or knights, to come out. But it's not a terrible move, and it's still possible to make it germane by the ensuing play. Correct. Although this move doesn't promote the development of white's bishops or knights, it does begin the assault on a key central base, D5, while not reducing white's options by blocking the queen-knight's most effective developing square, C3. Beginning this way has a name. It's called the English opening. It's important to realize, however, that just because the game begins in a particular opening with its own name doesn't mean that it couldn't be changed as play proceeds into a completely different opening with a different name. This is chess, and that's names. Which is a better first move for white? 1 Knight F3 or 1 Knight C3? Correct. This move assails a critical central square, E5, while getting the king-knight to its optimal opening perch, F3. It also clears one of the squares, G1, between the king and the king-rook at H1, so that white can castle kingside sooner. Incorrect. This is not a bad developing move. Although it expedites castling queenside over kingside, queenside castling tends to take longer while entailing a different set of problems. it does get the queen knight to a fine opening post, c3. It also hits at the central spot, d5. The move 1 knight b1 c3, however, is a little more committal than its kingside counterpart, 1 knight g1 f3. This is because it unnecessarily blocks the c-pawn before determining whether white needs to play an early c2 c4. More of white's opening formations rely on advancing the c-pawn, while fewer require advancing the f-pawn, which entails greater risk to the king. Which is a better first move for white? 1 knight c3 or 1 knight h3? Correct. From c3, white's knight aggresses the center while observing 8 different squares, the most it can ever do. Furthermore, the development doesn't incur any particular weaknesses. Most weaknesses are mainly spawned by prematurely and illogically advancing pawns, and not so much by moving pieces. This is because pawn moves tend to be more indelible. At the cost of a move or two, you can often, though not always, recover from an unwise piece maneuver by bringing the piece back to where it was. But with pawns, it's not just a matter of wasting time. Pawn moves are permanent. Pawns can never go back to where they were. Once a pawn move is made, the die is cast, and you must accept the consequences. Incorrect. This gets out a knight, but to the edge of the board, where its mobility is reduced. At h3, the king-knight attacks a mere 4 squares, which is half the power of a knight positioned at f3, or c3, or c6, or f6. Another problem is that at h3, the king-knight is potentially in line to be menaced and captured by the c8 bishop. This could lead to the disruption of white's kingside pawn cover after the foreseeable capture bishop c8 takes h3 and the anticipated recapture g2 takes h3. If white then castled kingside, or if he were already castled kingside, his king might be endangered, and the resulting doubled h-pawns could become targets. Which is a better opening move for white? 1 b3 or 1 h4? Correct. This doesn't directly attack the center, but it prepares to post the c1 bishop at b2, where it would snipe at the squares d4 and e5 from the flank. This kind of development is called a fianchetto and is particularly popular in the modern chess world. It's much less popular in other disciplines, such as football. Incorrect. This is a very weakening pawn move that contributes virtually nothing to development while greatly debilitating the king side. The h-pawn is likely to become a permanent liability, deterring white from castling kingside. If white were to castle kingside, the h-pawn would lose its original protector, the h1 rook. Which is a better opening move for white? 1 b4 or 1 a3? Correct. This advance fails to tackle the center directly, but it prepares for the queen-bishop's deployment to b2. From there, the bishop dominates the center's dark squares along the a1 h8 diagonal. The move's primary drawback is the b-pawn itself. On b4, the pawn tends to be a mark for black sharpshooters. Incorrect. This move doesn't attack the center, nor does it facilitate development. About all it does is guard b4, which may not be especially relevant in a game that hasn't as yet been delineated. But inferior moves, such as 1a3, shouldn't be taken lightly either. If black plays mechanically, thinking any old set of developing moves will do, it's possible that white might be able to steer the game into channels where a2, a3 has subsequent utility. This is why, if you really want to play chess well, you must work hard from move 1. Too often we play the first few moves by rote, and then start thinking on move 4 or 5, when it already might be too late. Which is a better opening move for white? 1g3 or 1g4? Correct. White's simple pawn move makes it possible to flank the king-bishop at g2, where it stands sentinel over e4 and d5. Once the king-bishop is then developed, white will be a step closer to castling kingside. Incorrect. This advance prepares the king-bishop's posting at g2, but it injures the g-pawn by placing it where it can easily be threatened. Moreover, several kingside squares are severely weakened, particularly f3, f4, h3, and h4. Once g2, g4 is played, none of these squares can ever again be guarded by the g-pawn, making them vulnerable to enemy piece invasion. White's kingside will be like Swiss cheese, full of holes. Which is a better first move for white? 1 f3 or 1 f4? Incorrect. This is a very poor move. It adds nothing to development and even deprives the king-knight of its best square, f3. It flails at the center square, e4, but it exposes the king to potential danger along the deadly e1, h4 diagonal. Along this pregnable line, e1, h4 for white, e8, h5 for black, many a short game has ended in a fool's mate. An unblockable queen check at h4 for black, and comparably, after black has opened f7, f6, an unblockable queen check at h5 for white. When I was younger, my compatriots at the Marshall Chess Club in New York used to call this beginning the King Charles attack, 1 f3 and 2 king f2. And you remember what happened to him. Correct. While not a developing move, f2, f4 doesn't hinder development either. It also brandishes its guns at e5, a focal middle point. In some situations, it can combine with white's queen-bishop when flanked on b2 and white's king-knight when activated to f3 to control the central dark squares d4 and e5. This is the kind of teamwork that wins chess games. Which opening move is better for white? 1 knight a3 or 1 h3? Correct. This is a tough call because neither move, knight b1 a3 or h2 h3, is meritorious. With 1 knight b1 a3, white activates a knight, but away from the center. One possibility is that later on the knight can be repositioned toward the center, let's say to c4. But the game might not develop along lines that render this transfer feasible or desirable. At least knight b1 a3 doesn't incur a pawn weakness, and this is something. Incorrect. This is a nebbishy start. It registers nothing in the center, and it snubs development. It also engenders a grave kingside weakness at g3. After moving the king-rook pawn, white may have difficulty securing this vulnerable square. And then there's the h-pawn itself, which becomes a point of attack if white castles kingside. The fact is, beginning a game by moving either rook pawn is asking for trouble.